Good evening and welcome to Writers in Conversation and to the ongoing Southampton Arts and Humanities Festival, all from the University of Southampton. We in the English department run Writers in Conversation 3 times each semester, and we're pleased to again be teaming up with the festival to bring you this event with the award-winning writer Patrice Lawrence and to an online audience. I'm Carole Burns, Head of Creative Writing for the English Department, and I'm so glad to be hosting Writers in Conversation for a second time with Patrice, who was our guest several years ago in 2018. We didn't record that wonderful talk, and it wasn't online, and she's published so many wonderful books since then, so I'm really delighted to have her back. Patrice's debut young adult novel, Orange Boy, won the bookseller. Hello, Patrice, by the way. There you are online. Nice to see you. Her debut novel, Orange Boy, won the bookseller YA Prize and the Waterstones Prize for Older Children's Fiction. Her 8 subsequent books, including Indigo Donut, have been both critically acclaimed and commercially successful. And this year, she won yet another prize, the JLAC Prize's inaugural children's and young adult category for her book, 8 Pieces of Silva, published last year. Her most recent book was published just in this August, Splinters of Sunshine. But we are asking Patrice to read from and talk about a slightly earlier book from 2019, in part because it's a historical novel set in Southampton in the Tudor period. Diver's Daughter is a book in the Voices series published by Scholastic, which brings to life authentic, unsung stories from the past. In this case, the past is an African diver named Jock Francis. And Patrice has invented a fictional story of a young Black girl and her mother who meet him after she saves her daughter by diving into the water. But you are, of course, welcome to ask her about any of her work. I noticed on Twitter today that I think it was either a mother or a school teacher who asked about a character in Snap. Patrice was born in Brighton, brought up in an Italian-Trinidadian family in mid-Sussex, and now lives in Hastings. She worked for more than 20 years for charities supporting equality and social justice, and published her first novel just in 2016, a statistic I was kind of amazed to see. I thought you'd been decades of writing all these wonderful books.
I have, but none of them got published before.
So. Oh, I see. Well, she now has an MBE for her services to children's literature, but enough from me. Patrice, welcome again to Writers in Conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I think you're going to read from the opening of Diver's Daughter, and then we'll ask a few questions and hear from some of it maybe later in the book after that. So, but I love this opening. So I'm really delighted to have you read from it.
When I teach sort of deliver writing, creative writing workshops, I always tell people to think about what their fear is. And as you can, when I read this, you can imagine what one of my fears is. So the first chapter is called The First Dive. I hit the water. No, it hit me. It slapped me in the face, then pulled me under. My head filled with its stink. I tried to hold my breath, but the water's wet fingers were in my nostrils, inching up and up. I couldn't open my mouth to scream. If I did, I'd be dead. But at this rate, I was going to be dead anyway. The River Thames' strong arms yanked me away from the boat, away from my mother, away from my life. Below the surface, the Thames talks to you. It's a stab of beaks as the gulls dive for fish. It's a sound of oars plunging in and out of the heavy water as pilots guide the merchant ships up to the Wool Quay. As I sank further down, I thought I heard different sounds, proper voices, children's voices like mine. If I could open my eyes, I was sure I'd see those children floating on the current, children like me who'd wobbled and fallen. Tell us your story, Eve, they whispered. Tell us your story. So what's my fear there?
That is, I'll have you know that yesterday I read that second paragraph to my partner, Paul, because I just thought it was so magnificent.
Thank you.
And yeah, no, it's just a wonderful story overall. So how did you first hear about this diver, Jock, and how did you come up with the story of this young girl and her mother around that historical fact?
It was one of those serendipity things, actually. I'd heard that she's seen a background. I have Miranda Kaufman's Black Tudors. And I'd actually heard her speak. I've met Miranda before, and I'd heard her talking about it. Miranda's an academic who's done all the hard work, going through all the files and all the documents, charting the lives of people of mostly, I suppose, African descent who lived during that period. And of course, it's one of those works that, challenges the preconceptions that Black people only came to the UK in 1948. So I'd actually bought the book in hardback for like, £19.99 or something. And I was very happy to do so. And for my local bookshop. And then Tony Bradman, who's a children's writer, a very prolific children's writer, contacted me because he had seen David Olusoga's series on Black British history, and actually felt quite angry that there was just so much he didn't know because we're not taught anything about this in the UK. So he'd contacted Scholastic Books and suggested a series of books for upper primary school inspired by UK Black and Asian history. So Ballyray wrote the first one about an Indian soldier in Dunkirk. And I was given a choice between Romans or Tudors. Now, as much as I love the Romans, having obviously just spent £17.99 on a hardback Black Tudors, I thought that's going to be my one. Also, my mother was brought up in colonial Trinidad, so all the history that she learned is white history, and she absolutely loves that Tudor period. So as soon as she learned to drive, we spent most of our time in a car going from sort of Kent to Sussex to Hampshire to stately home to castles. And I kind of often say there isn't a priest hole I haven't seen in the south of England because we went through all of those houses. So there was kind of that in there as well. But I'd read about Jack Francis, and there was part of me that, again, there's that slight fury about history we don't know, because I remember the Mary Rose being lifted out of Portsmouth Harbour in the early 80s. I was a teenager and being slightly disconnected from it. And again, having no sense that Black people had been, in the south of England so many centuries before and had that connection to it. So that kind of drove me to want to write that story as well and to bring us back into the Tudor period. I mean, I think the final thing really is because it's a book that's going into schools, I wanted to write it from a child's point of view. So that's why I wanted to write about a child in poverty and a child whose mother has experienced enslavement and is traumatized by that, but who has this amazing talent to be able to dive deeply. So kind of all of that mix of things came together and eventually formed the book.
And did you make the mother a diver because of Jock, and that way she might end up meeting him? Or was it your fear of water, which you suggested?
It was just one of those, I think, a really honest answer is that I think the first chapter that I read, I just free wrote, because I just thought, I don't know where I'm going to start with this. And it played in lots of different ways. And I didn't know where Jack Francis was going to be. I really wanted it to start off in London, mainly so I could lurk around the Museum of London and look at their models of Tudor houses. And then I thought, I need to take it out. And then as I read more, actually, I found one of the interesting things about Jack Francis that he's the first man of African descent who's recorded as giving evidence in a sort of British court and an English court. And I read that actually in a book in sort of Southampton library. So a lot of the action with that Jack Francis actually took place in Southampton rather than the sort of Mary Rose in Portsmouth. That was kind of almost like a diversion to bring it in. So I thought it was just interesting again that often, the history of Black people in England is usually just seen as London. So again, taking it out to other places, I felt. So the fact that Joan, his mum, is a diver, I think it was almost coincidental because I kind of wrote the scene and then I imagined her diving in to save her daughter, as you would, because I can't swim. But imagine if my daughter fell in, I'd probably be the person who would dive in trying to save her and had to be rescued. But I just thought her mum would instantly dive in. I thought, but what if she can? What if she can dive that deeply? And that sort of gave me the momentum for the story.
Wonderful. And the pace of this book is relentless. Can you talk about how you go about plotting a novel?
I'm a bit rubbish at it, and I
There's no evidence of that, I'll tell you.
I mean, I suppose I'm the person who wastes lots of words by writing. I do a lot of free writing because I give myself a prompt or get a prompt from somewhere and just write around it, thinking, where will it take me? I mean, I knew physically where it would take me, but I'm not very good at visualizing things, so I have to be in a place. So I spend quite a lot of time in Southampton, just walking around, looking at the medieval walls, touching them, imagine where the sea used to come in and what that would be like, you know, the sort of connection to the sort of the Solent to the sea. I've got this book here and I was just looking at it, and I just sat in this sort of big library in Southampton, just making loads of notes, things like, what were the plants? Well, periwinkle equal joy, honeysuckle equals affection and marriage. You know, eglantine was a symbol of Elizabeth I, because all of these for me can be little prompts and give me ideas. I looked at the Watergate and what the different gates and the sort of, you know, the walls in Southampton, and thought what they could be. And then there's a sense of thinking about, where do I want the characters to end? So I thought, I always think about the end before I think of I can get the middle. So where do I want them to be? And I thought, it's a children's book, I want them happy. So how do I get them happy? And then I just think of three things with my characters. I think about what is it that they fear, and in this case, it's drowning. You know, what is it they want? And in this case, it's to be out of poverty. And for Eve, what does she desire? Well, actually, what she desires is her mum to be okay and for the family to be happy. Then I kind of plot towards that, sticking as many challenges and obstacles as I can in the way.
Yeah. One of the things I tell my students is that you need to raise the stakes for your characters.
Absolutely.
And put them in as much pressure as possible. Was that, in a strange way, easier in Tudor England, especially for Black characters? I mean, because anybody could have apparently, I learned in your novel, their ear nailed to a wall as punishment for being a witch. And you know, a Black character was a person was in risk of being kidnapped and put back into slavery, even in England.
Not so much in Elizabethan side, slightly later, because Elizabeth tried to get the blueprint for sort of for the wholesale cargo of people, but didn't quite get it. The Portuguese were in there for ages, so they had their forts, you know, all around sort of you know, Africa and into South America. The sort of English hadn't quite got there yet. They were just a little bit sort of later to do the real wholesale sort of cargo, but it was still out looking for gold. In some ways, it could be more egalitarian, because I think a lot of it was down to how much money you had, and but I think for me, it was actually the poverty that's the real issue. It's trying to survive when you have no money. You know, what do you do? And just reading a lot of the accounts, you know, of how people just, you know, froze to death, and people's vulnerabilities, and particularly women with sort of children as well. And so for me, that was it. But, you know, there's also lots of challenges, because I knew nothing about Tudor England other than what I'd seen in sort of mostly on fictional TV programs. So every detail, you know, particularly as a lot of what we see about Tudor England is usually the wealthy. So all these, you know, paintings are often of, you know, wealthy clothes. And so, you know, what do poor people wear on a fee? If somebody had to get from London to Southampton, how could they travel, you know, if they had no money? How do they clean their pots? So all of those things, every detail had to be researched. So some of it led to other plot points. That was quite handy. But I think it's hard to equate the challenges, because I think there's so many challenges for Black people now in today's society. So it's hard to equate.
The other thing, as well as your lots of plot twists and the pace is relentless, as I said, your scenes move very quickly too. So it sounds like you do a lot of free writing. Do you do a lot of editing then? Do you like kind of really have to work on that conciseness?
Yes, I think this book is probably shorter since one, because I was very aware that it was something that might go into schools, and I think that was the aim. If we could tie it into relate it to the curriculum in some ways, and to school learning and primary school learning, then it would be, you know, the take up of it would be much would improve, would be really good. And so we'd be sliding the Black history in there in lots of different ways, whether it's in English lessons around vocabulary, whether it's around history, and a whole sort of range of things. So you kind of want to keep that pace going, to keep, you know, younger people interested, and particularly if they're reading maybe chapters in class as well. I think you'd need to sort of keep it quite short, I think. I mean, and for me, it's a learning curve as well, because many of the books I'd written before, were for older, age
Yes.
groups,
Yes.
or with older characters, or I'd write short stories at that age, for younger people as well. So it was all for me a learning curve about how to write, an
Yeah.
adventure, I suppose, for that age.
Yeah. And your language was also so vivid. Were you, how did you manage that for a younger group? And how do you think about language when you're writing?
I think I suppose I don't. I just think, there's just so many different ways to tell a story. And part of the joy of being a writer is to experiment with that. And it's interesting because the books for young adults were harder for me because I wasn't brought up in London. I'm not, and that's a perception usually as a Black person that they're brought up in London, but I was brought up in Sussex and I didn't move to London until I was in my late 20s and I had to kind of learn London in a sense. But because of that, I think it made me a bit more scrupulous, really listening to people and the resonance of their voices and how people tell stories. And this I knew would be a different type of story. And I'd read, and because I was such a reader, I think when I was younger as well. So I've read these types of books when I was younger. So you kind of absorb, I suppose, the ways that you can tell a story. I think, and then you do, like you said, you edit it and edit. You sort of abandon it for a while, go back to think, oh my days, I need to work through it again. And then, of course, Scholastic have editors that can help as well. But if I can, I like to try and I never submit a first draft. It's usually a 6th or 7th draft that I submit because I'd love to spend the time with editors, just polishing and polishing and polishing and polishing. I think to make it as good as it could possibly be.
Yeah. Well, I'm pleased to say that we have our first question from the audience. So let me see. The question reads, you really bring medieval Southampton to life. Was there anything you discovered in the course of your research that was interesting, but didn't get incorporated into the book?
Oh, masses. I was just looking at the pages and pages of stuff. I made pages of notes. I really did. So post 1588 at war with Spain, wrote all about the Armada and the Spanish couldn't land, and churches put out Philip of Spain chests to collect money for injured soldiers. I thought it was really interesting. So these sort of early days collecting for soldiers. And lots of stuff about pigs roaming Southampton streets that I found really interesting. There was, I made a whole list of professions. I thought, can I squeeze these in here? So like pursemaker. So Margaret Primmer made the purse bottom for Elizabeth I's gift of a purse for Southampton. I thought, is there any way I can get that in there? Like, no. Peter Bourne was a glazier and he glazed almshouses. There was ditch diggers on common land, and there's a yeoman of the mail. Oh, what a job, The pewterers and oyster draggers. I mean, would you not want to be an oyster dragger? So I made all of these notes because I'm actually really geeky, and I just find all of this stuff incredibly interesting. And I don't really know Southampton, so I actually really enjoyed that process of getting to know Southampton through its history and being there. And I even stayed overnight in what would have been, I suppose, an old coaching inn, except it really didn't look old now, but the shape of it was. Because I was trying to work out, you stayed at a coaching inn, where did the horses come in? Where would the stables be? So I stayed and had a gin and cocktail in a hotel there. But lots of stuff I learned. I looked at the old sort of Tudor houses in Southampton, just stood there looking at them and tried to imagine what it would like to be in them and the shape of them. And is it St. Patrick's Church in the square? I think an old church which has got the sort of effigies of because I think it presumably went from Catholic to Protestant because it's that old, I suppose. And so looked at that as well, because that would have been around at that time, and tried to picture, what the people coming and going to church. But yeah, there's pages of stuff. Maybe one day I'll recycle and write about oyster draggers.
Sounds like you should. Absolutely. So I realized we talked all about the technology in our beforehand, but I forgot to say that I'd want you to read a second section. Do you have a section that you would like to read from the book? Or
I'll read from the next chapter, I think.
Okay, great.
So so you can get a sense of what's happened next. The second chapter is called A Puppet for a Penny. And I suppose with this chapter, again, I sometimes have this little bag of ingredients of things that I want to write about. And I really wanted to write about Bartholomew Fair because it's just so renowned. And because I've walked, I used to walk past, Bart's Hospital and that area around there so many times and catch my sort of 56 bus there. I just thought, trying to imagine it, 400 or 500 years earlier, I think. And the fact that that hospital has been on those grounds for so long, I just find really fascinating. So, A Puppet for a Penny. My name is Eve. I'm 12 years old, and I'm surprised I've lived that long. I'm a Southwark girl, born and bred, just outside London, across the River Thames, but I lived in other places too. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for breath. In my dreams, the bed linen turns to water, pressing against my eyes, blocking my ears to everything apart from my slamming heart. Then I hear my mother calling me, "Mapendwa, are you safe?" She calls me Mapendwa, her beloved. I surface out of my nightmare into the morning. 3 times I've ended up in deep water so far. Twice I nearly drowned. The third time, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll start by telling you about the first time. It was the first day of the Bartholomew Fair. I'd never been to the fair before, even though every year Mama had promised to take me. You know what adults are like. They look you in the eye, make you a promise, then forget it by the time they look away. But Mama isn't like that. She doesn't make promises that she doesn't think she can keep because so many people have broken promises to her. There was a good reason why Mama hadn't kept her promise before. The fair lasts for 3 days in August, and on the first day, every year, I'd wake up, lie still and listen. Every year, I'd hear the same thing, rain. I could hear it dripping into the pots Mama had lined up under the eaves. That is the years when we even had eaves, of course. The August before, we'd had nowhere to sleep, and we came close to being arrested as vagabonds. Eventually, we'd sneaked into a grain store, but we spent the dark hours fighting what must have been the king rat of Southwark. I knew that we definitely wouldn't be going to the fair that year. The summers when we did have somewhere to live, I'd creep out of bed and check outside to see how bad the rain was, and it would always be the same. Mud and dung oozing across the cobbles, trampled into a slippery mix by the horses' hooves, with little rivers of mud running along the pathways, mixing the muck into a special sticky mess that never wanted to let go of you. Even the dogs looked sideways at it and tried to find a way round it. Mum and I didn't have fancy leather boots or even a pair of clogs to get us through that mess. I just had my old pumps, and no matter how many times Mama tried to sew it back, the seam kept unravelling, so my toes stuck out the front. By the time I'd walked 3 steps in that mud, I'd been barefoot. So that's kind of just setting up the scene before she gets to the fair and nearly drowns for her troubles.
Right. Excellent.
You can tell I did research on Tudor shoes, can't you? Like, I'm getting the shoes in.
That one you got in.
Yeah, I did.
Well, that you're reading that section, especially that when she introduces herself, leads really naturally to another question from the audience, and this is from my wonderful colleague Rebecca Smith at the University of Southampton. And Rebecca asks, "Please, could you tell us a bit about creating your characters' voices and making them sound Tudor but comprehensible for contemporary young readers?" And thank you.
I made a decision not to make them sound Tudor in a sense because I think I would end up sounding like a Shakespearean sort of parody, I think. So for me, it was a mix of trying to make her sound like a London girl and to try to make her also sound like a sort of a 12-year-old and relatable to sort of younger children because in sort of in primary school. But what I was really conscious of not having any anachronisms is a word. So really thinking about words. So I'd find myself thinking like, so what did they use the word breakfast then? Because I'm thinking about what you'd eat in the morning. Was that a term that was used later? Would they use the term picnic? Well, no, they wouldn't. Lullaby. So all those words, I'd sort of red flag certain words and think about whether there were words that existed in that period of England. But for me, I thought, it was very important that she was telling her own story and that the story would feel relatable, but that it would also incorporate the world around us. So there's also a lot of thought about how you can, a bit like the shoes, for instance, I wanted the reader to know early that she was poor and that she lived in Southwark and that she's really excited about this fair. So a lot of it was how could I explain her circumstances without feeling that I'm dolloping, a great big skip full of exposition.
Right.
in it. And that, again, you know, it's writing and rewriting and rethinking and trying to sort of plan things. But in my forehead, she's a South London girl. And I lived in North London, and I was snobby about South London girls. So I thought, yeah, South London girl.
Well, she also really, what you also bring out, though, in addition to this entire world and her circumstances, is her personality comes flying out of those first pages. Did you always know she'd be this very strong?
That was, I mean, I think that was really important to me, because I think, and it's particularly, again, when I write books for young adults, I really think about how young women are presented and about the agency they have over their own lives. So Splinters of Sunshine, that you mentioned earlier, has got a character called Dee who's had a lot of struggles in her life and ends up quite vulnerable and selling drugs. But for me, it was really important that she didn't come across, in a sense, as a victim, and for her to have her own personality. So for me, I always start with characters and think about my characters. So maybe that feeds into the question before about it being set in Tudor times. For me, the character comes first. You know, who are they? You know, what are their fears? But also really want them sparky. I really want them to try and have agency, and sometimes to be a bit sulky and to be just really human. And to be 12 as well. Yeah. So for me, that is the most important thing, particularly when I'm writing young women, and particularly writing young women of colour. And I think there is that history, particularly of Black people being presented in British history quite often as enslaved people. And we've never been presented as having agency over our lives and our world. So again, for me, I wanted Eve, and her mother, you know, has gone through so much as well. But I wanted Eve to have a little bit of power whenever she could, even if it was just to sulk, but she would have some power.
Yeah. So as you talk about that, people know how important it is for children to have a kind of role models or see themselves in fiction. Were you like that as a child? Can you remember a story that you had, or were you looking around in vain for?
No, it just never occurred to me.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't even that. And that's the thing, I think, you know, people don't understand that. It wasn't even thinking about, do I see myself represented? It did not even occur to me that I could be represented. And because the books that I sort of tended to grow up with, you know, there were still some really offensive books around at that time. For instance, that Little Black Sambo, I think, was still around. And for anybody who's not seen it, it's like a figure, like it's a sort of caricatured little African figure with like a bone through his nose. For some reason, I had a copy of that, and I don't know how, but I remember my mum being so furious that I ended up with a copy of this book. Lots of gollywogs around as well at that time, Enid Blyton books and sort of other books. And I read a lot when I was younger. I was fostered from the age of 4 months to 4 years by a white working class family in Brighton who taught me to read very young, and, you know, and signed me up to the library and really encouraged me to sort of write and be creative. But the books, you know, I was borrowing from the library were like Hugh Lofton's original Dr. Dolittle books, which he illustrated himself. And again, there's a caricature of an African prince called Prince Bumpo. And his storyline is that if he gets a princess, he's got to bleach himself white. And I think I probably read that when I was 5 or 6. So everything I absorbed about Black people in books was that we could only be there if we were caricatures. And it was, you know, and I didn't even know the word offensive, because also growing up again in England in the 70s, a lot of TV was like that. A lot of media was like that. You know, there was a show called A Black and White Minstrel Show on for 20 years where it was on Saturday, BBC One, at sort of the tea time show, the big show, which was white guys in blackface doing jazz hands. And that was on for 20 years. So that was actually the way the world was. And I didn't know any different in terms of that's what you absorb. So it did not occur to me. And that stuck with me really in terms of my own writing until my 30s, that we couldn't be in books and we couldn't write books. So every character I wrote was white, because I just didn't, you know, I so absorbed and internalized that racism that we were not allowed to be in books. So it took a really, really long time to do that. But the first, sorry.
No, you go.
I was just going to say the first book that did change it for me was one called Le Didikoi by Rumoured. And it's because I'd made a series about it on BBC called Kizzy, about a young girl of Gypsy heritage who has to leave her community to go to mainstream school and gets bullied for basically who she is, which in a sense is about racism. And even though I couldn't articulate that, it explained to me why some of my experiences were different from all of my white friends growing up in Sussex. So again, there's something so important for me in books about that representation, about how sometimes as a children's writer, there's such a responsibility on us, because we can articulate things that maybe children and young people can't articulate for themselves. And it's really important, I feel, that when we do that, we don't do harm, that if things happen, there are consequences.
And do you think that's why you're a writer for children?
No, that was just an accident.
Was it? Doesn't sound like it.
It didn't occur to me. I mean, it's weird because actually I've got 2 much younger brothers, and I always used to write for them and tell them stories and illustrate them. And they still talk, they're sort of, I call him my little brother, but he's, a big hulking man in his mid-40s. But he still remembers, the stories I used to write for him all the time. It's do you know what I think? Strangely enough, I thought writing for children would be more difficult than writing for adults, I think. And I suppose I loved books so much when I was a child. It just felt I just put them on such a pedestal that I just felt I could never be able to do that. So, but once I started writing for sort of young adults, I thought, oh, all right then, maybe I can do this. And then, had commissions to write stories for younger age. I got into my stride. Also, when my daughter was younger, I stole a lot of her sort of life as well. And now she's older, I'm thinking like, damn, can't you age backwards like Benjamin Button? But,
So we have a question from Sandra from the audience. Can I ask how much time you use from the idea coming until finishing a book?
Oh, that's really kind of hard because I mull over ideas quite a lot, I think, and they spend so much time in my head and characters. And what I tend to do is once, so I'll give you an example, not this book, I'll give you an example, for instance, with Indigo Donut, because that's probably the clearest example. When Orange Boy was accepted for publication, I was working full time, and it was a sort of 2-book deal, and it was not very much money, so there's no way I was giving up my job if I wanted to eat. And so I was working full time and sort of looking after my daughter, and I didn't expect a 2-book deal, so Indigo Donut was only a paragraph. And I think then what I ended up with loads of ideas that are mulling in my head. So one was the idea of indigo as a colour, and I just thought, what if she had this was a young woman and she had siblings all named after colours of the rainbow. So scarlet, coral, primrose, teal, bluebell, indigo and violet. But what if she didn't know them? So I do loads of what ifs. And I thought, why wouldn't she know them? And maybe they'd all been in the care system and separated. And then at the same time, it was a time when young people who were in foster care with foster families had to leave their foster families when they were 18. And I was thinking, how could you do that? I could not imagine saying to my daughter, who was very independent, when she was 18, you had to leave now. I think that was utter cruelty. So I was angry about that. And then Peaches Geldof, Bob Geldof's daughter, died, and she died of a heroin overdose. And her children were in their sort of home when it happened. And the same thing happened to Peaches Geldof's mother, Paula Yates. And I remember thinking that no matter how much you try to protect those children, now with social media, everybody has an opinion. So people's lives are sort of dragged around online. But what if a younger woman like Indigo had that same experience, but that she hasn't got a protective factor? So she's followed from school to school and school. So I kind of had all these ingredients, and I did lots of mind maps of what if. And then with that book, I did get quite stuck because I couldn't work out what if. So again, I had to go back to the really basics and think, what does Indigo want? Well, actually, she's scared that she's inherited her dad's anger. She thinks that her dad killed her mum. She's scared she's inherited her dad's anger. She wants to be loved and to love people. And once I worked that out, I thought, now I can do all the challenges. Now I can do all the So I had to literally go back to that. But with children's publishing, and particularly with the young adults, they kind of want a book a year. So Indigo Donut followed Orange Boy, and then I knew I just couldn't write another book in a year and work full time. It was too exhausting. So Rose interrupted. I had a 1-book deal in 18 months. And then I sort of gave up work. So I was getting enough sort of additional work. And so then the next two, 8 Pieces of Silver and Splinter Sunshine came after a year. But I also wrote other books at the same time and short stories. So I'd say kind of like 18 months is around the time, I think, 18 months to 2 years, because I'm usually thinking about the ideas long before I actually put anything on paper.
But at first it was a little bit longer.
Orange Boy was an accident because I was at a creative, I was a participant in a creative writing week, crime writing residential week in Devon. and I sort of wanted to write crime, and I love crime books, and that still filters through, all of my books. So I was either going to write something set in East London in the 1930s or something set in Trinidad in the 1940s, and ended up on a writing prompt coming up at the beginning of Orange Boy. So it's just a writing prompt, and I just thought, like, he's 16 and he's at a fairground, and he's a girl he really likes, way above his league, and he's got like an ecstasy tablet in his pocket because it's like crime. And then they come up to Ghost Train and she's dead. And I just wrote that, and I presumed it was like an adult crime book. I didn't know YA existed until somebody said, "Oh, you're writing YA." Oh, am I? So it was an accident. I had to take out some of the swearing.
Yeah. Well, the next question from Karis, who's currently doing our MA in creative writing, is that she read Indigo Donut, and music plays a big role in it. And at the back of the book, she says you mentioned that music is important in your writing. So could you talk about that? And did you listen to Tudor music when you wrote Lyra's Daughter? And she also loves your writing too, by the way.
I think, I didn't listen to Tudor music. I think I wouldn't know what to even listen to. I should have actually, but because for me, those two characters wouldn't have had much access to music, I suppose. And I think if I was writing wealthier characters, I probably would have listened to the music to try and get into the heads of those characters. Yes, music really impacts on my emotions a lot. So when I was writing Indigo Donut, I listened to Nick Cave's Into My Arms on loop at certain scenes, and a bit of James Taylor for other things. With 8 Pieces of Silver, actually, I wrote a little blog with 8 songs relating to Spotify, because there's a lot of Korean pop in it. And I was really interested, particularly in Korean pop and sort of other popular culture, about how it creates fandoms and how they bring together people from across the world, which I just think is an amazing thing to do. So for that, the K-pop had that role, but also just wanted to get Bex and her friends trying to do some of the choreography in the kitchen, because good grief, how those young people all jump at the same time, their knees face the same direction. It's a miracle. So I just wanted that sense of, and then with Splinters of Sunshine, I actually did put something on Twitter. I wanted to do a Spotify playlist that was inspired by wildflowers. And it was just such a timeline cleanse, because obviously there's so many people who are impacted by music in different ways. So lots of people suggested things. So the playlist is something like, I can't remember if it's like either 5 or it's something like 90 songs on it anyway, from like Dolly Parton's, lots of bits of country in there, and there's a little Queen song, and a little bit of the Doors, and then there's, it's just such an amazing playlist as well. It's an Italian, Korean, Japanese, French, Gaelic. It's fantastic. And I think music is one of those things that kind of high you can get if you're at a gig or something and everybody's singing the same song and you're all there. And I think, I actually did buy a book at one point when I was writing Orange Boy, because I was interested about because Marlon in Orange Boy is really interested in how the brain works. So I was really interested about how music works on the brain as well. It also works really well on mine. So yeah, all with the Splinters of Sunshine, I only managed to get a little bit of Queen in at the beginning, and that was it. I'm going to get that music in there, but yeah, all of them. And also, I think the other thing is for music is it creates memories. So for me, I can hear a certain song. It's a bit like like Smell can, and think, oh my gosh, I was with that person, or I remember that moment, or we were there when I heard that song. So again, it is that kind of like sort of shortcut into memory, which I bring into writing as well.
Yeah. Well, there is one song in Lyra's Daughter where Eve remembers a song her mother used to sing.
Yes, actually, memory, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it was actually then, and I was thinking, did the word lullaby exist or not then? And it didn't. So yes.
Did you research that song, or did you just have her remember something?
I didn't research it, no.
Yeah.
I think, but I want to, again, that music, and also about how music gets passed from generation to generation, I think, is that connection, isn't it, as well? So I did want that for her, but I just didn't know how I was going to do it, because, they wouldn't be listening to the sort of the court trumpeters at all playing the court, so where would you get that? But there would have been a cacophony on the streets, I imagine, as well, like Bartholomew's Fair and all of these things, that there would have been music and musicians.
Yeah. You mentioned music and emotion. Our next question from Wan Chen is, who's also doing our MA, is, do you unconsciously add your own emotion to your characters as you're writing, or maybe you even consciously? I mean, is that something that you're
all the time? Very, very consciously. Yeah, very. And I think if you are writing characters, and I suppose there's this thing that we want with characters, we want them to be relatable, but we don't want them to be generic. We want them to be unique. And I think for me to make, for me personally to make characters relatable and have some sort of authenticity to them, I bring a lot of myself to all of the characters. And sometimes, my daughter doesn't read my YA, and I'm so grateful because she goes, oh my gosh, that's Mum, I know that. Oh, right. And I do. So things like, experiences, positive and negative experiences. So in 8 Pieces of Silver, I wanted to celebrate female friendship. So even now, my 50s, my female friends are the most, are like family, but less problematic. Those are the people I go to in trouble. We have fantastic times. So I bring that joy of female friendship, but also, I've lots of experiences of feeling an outsider, both in terms of being visibly, ethnically different growing up, but also in terms of going to London and having a very different growing up experience from many Caribbean Londoners as well. So particularly for writing for young adults, that experience of outsidership is really, really, useful. So I bring a lot of emotion to, and a lot of my own experiences into. And I also, I think, even with Diver's Daughter, you've got a single parent family. So I bring a lot of experience of living different, family types. I mean, I've never lived in a family where we're all the same colour. I've never lived with my biological dad, all of these things. So that shapes very much the families that I write about as well, because I want to celebrate different types of family. So yeah, absolutely. It's quite conscious and probably subconscious as well, but I'm a bit scared to think what that might reveal about me.
You alluded earlier to like not daring to write yourself for a while. Can you talk about your path to becoming a writer? When did you first? Oh, you were writing for your brother. It sounds like when you were little. How did all this evolve?
I loved writing at school, and I was always encouraged by teachers. And then when I was at secondary school, there were 2 particular English teachers, Miss Clark then and Mr. Jones, who really encouraged me to write and send off things to like the Mid Sussex, arts, festival or story. So my teachers, actually, what was lovely was when Orange Boy won the prizes, both of those teachers who were newly qualified teachers when I was at school, who are now retiring, both found me on social media and congratulated me and said that they always knew I would do that. But also I could thank them because I think Miss Clark encouraged us to read, I think it was Z for Zephaniah and Mr. Jones, Paul Zindell's Pigman. And then I went to Hayward Heath Library and read all the other Paul Zindels and all the S.E. Hintons. And that must have percolated away in my head for a long time, thinking, this is writing about teenagers and felt sort of contemporary at that time because there'd been nothing like that, certainly in terms of English and British books. And I went on to Tolkien, and that pops up a lot in my books as well, like Lord of the Rings geekiness as well. So yeah, do I bring my own emotions like Lord of the Ring geek? Yeah. And so, but I still wrote, and then I wrote a couple of short stories that shame on me, but were published in things like True Romances, because I am so unromantic. So that was interesting. But I got paid for them, wrote a version of The Wizard of Oz for my 6th form that we put on as a play that was like updated of Michael Jackson's Thriller. And my claim to fame is that the sound man on that, Matt Osman, was a bass player in the indie band Suede. So,
All right.
I sort of wrote and wrote. I was a real compulsive writer, and I've still got boxes, loads of things. And I think for me, and I think in some ways, I feel a bit sorry for people who are writing now to get published, because it feels like the writing is writing to get published. And I think people struggle with some of the setbacks, because it is really hard to get published, because publishing isn't a meritocracy, it isn't about the best story or the best book. It's what somebody in publishing subjectively thinks they could sell. And I really feel for people, whereas I think, because I had no expectations of necessarily being published, but I wrote because I just loved writing and I love stories. So the publishing bit, I never thought I would be where I am now. It just was not something that would occur to me. I'm very happy I am, but I never thought that. And then I when I was 32, I had a baby in London, and I suddenly thought, a new millennium, there should be lots of books with sort of mixed heritage families in them, and I found none. And I found a book called What About Me, written by Helen Stevens, I think, that had the picture on the front had a little girl, light brown skin, curly hair, freckles. And my baby daughter, who was 9 months, used to kiss that picture thinking it was me. And then you think, if a baby is looking for that recognition, why the hell am I not writing characters like us? But then also at the same time, when I just had her, I was turned on the TV and there was Mallory Blackman, the BBC adaptation of Mallory Blackman's Pig Heart Boy. So it was an English family, a black family. It wasn't a Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and it wasn't about gangs or crime. It was about loyalty and love and ethics. And I remember just bursting into tears. That could have been like post-pregnancy hormones. But it was just literally, this door had opened for me thinking, it's absolutely, I have permission to write, inspired, shaped by my own experiences about who I am and the people I know, and not make them white. And through that, I think I found my voice. And it still took a while of working out whether I wanted to write film scripts or whatever, but I just wrote anything. I've got no shame, I write anything. But it took until my 30s. And once I found my voice, I still didn't quite know what I wanted to write. But I think that was a shove towards it. It just gave me that confidence, because I just thought, doesn't matter if it doesn't get published, that's my voice.
And is that when you did your MA in creative writing?
I did my MA with my I did my MA in writing for film and TV. So that was when my daughter was 1. And I was working full time. Now I think, how? I remember I was literally breastfeeding her, writing a dissertation with the other. But I got a distinction because I obviously really wanted it. But I think for that, it really taught me things about arcs of stories, but also my love of listening to the resonances of people's voices, and about how people tell stories in different ways and how you can use that in writing. And I think that's why I really love writing contemporary YA, because you can just really play with voice in that, which is my real joy.
Yeah. But then, as I mentioned, when I noticed the detail that your Orange Boy was published in 2016, it's only 2021. You just feel like you've been important on the scene for 10 or 15 years. So how long before Orange Boy kind of came about and then you had your first novel published? What was that path like?
Well, I'd had an agent for quite a few years before, and I think I was really lucky that I got an agent at a time before you had to write a full book. Because I wondered now, but how do people do this? How do they do that? And I met Caroline at an event. It was British Book Awards. So I'd had a short story published in an anthology, which had been targeting Black and Asian writers. So it was like a partnership between the Arts Council and Hamish Hamilton, who published Bernardine Evaristo. And I think we're part of sort of Penguin now. And they would publish the anthology. So I had a short story which I'd written, kind of slightly not plagiarizing, but it was a story that my daughter's dad had told me. He was white, working class, grew up in Hackney, and our lives were just like negatives of each other, so very different. And I just loved that story. And it's a teenage story, so I wrote it as a sort of teenage story. So in this book of Black and Asian writers, I write a story about a white boy, typical. But I think kind of what it showed was like I could just get into voice when I heard it. And I got invited to an event at the Arts Council, their table at the British Book Awards. But I think it's because literally somebody pulled out. They only asked me a day before. So I just thought, it's free supper. Yeah, I'll do that. Yeah. And then I finished work, changed in a lose when I got there, and just realised I knew nobody at all, just nobody. And I just stood at the top of the stairs, like drinking Prosecco very hastily, thinking I know nobody. Then I saw John Agard, who recently got the Lifetime Achievement Award from Book Trust, and Grace Nichols. And I'd met them before, nothing to do with writing. So I'm going to weave my Prosecco-y self down and say hello. And Caroline is John's agent. So I chatted to her. She got a copy of the anthology. I pitched an idea to her and she took me on. Many years later, and many books written that still remain in a drawer. She was just very patient. I wrote about 5 or 6 books before one got published. It really took time. And that's just, I couldn't write books. I had ideas. I had characters, but I really struggled. So the first couple of books that were published were part of educational writing schemes, reading schemes, they're called. So one was Granny Ting Ting, inspired by my auntie in Trinidad, which is actually now being reprinted by Bloomsbury, so like Bloomsbury game there. And another one was for Pearson, that was again inspired by Trinidad as well. But even those small books taught me how to write a book for a certain readership, taught me how to work with editors and the difference in working with different types of editors as well, and how to create a cohesive arc and the amount of editing that I would need to do to try and bring a story to life. So even that, that really taught me the sort of bones of how to really think about writing books. And then I was part of a writing group for a very long time as well. And I think without them, I wouldn't have got published. So they really helped me take out some really dodgy subplots from Orange Boy. Jenny Downham, who's an amazing writer for young adults, mentored me through that first process as well, and was like an early reader and gave me kind of lots of advice. So I had lots of help coming in for that as well to help me shape that book. And each book you learn, I still learn every single book I write about what I could do better, what I could do differently, or what I could explore in a different way. And I love that process.
Yeah. Just to encourage the audience to keep sending questions. We have one from earlier, though, from, again, my colleague, Rebecca Smith. Did you use maps in Diver's Daughter, or did you draw your own maps?
No, I didn't draw my map, but I spent a really lot of time online looking at Elizabethan maps of Southampton, especially, and of Southwark, a really, really long time. Particularly, and I like doing it when I was actually in Southampton Library. There's something about sitting in that library, looking at those maps as well. And then I'd walk around a city and try and picture it, and I'd bring it up on my phone. And because you still had those medieval walls in Southampton, I was trying to equate, that ruin that's a Biddlegate, and that would have been a Watergate, and sort of imagining the ways that the water came in and where the houses would be, and the gates as I walked through the gates, at the end of the road, and the giants and stuff. So I did. And also I love looking at old maps of London. There's actually one behind me now as well, which is more from the 18th century as well, for something I'm writing at the moment. And I was just so fascinated about how some places still keep their names through all those centuries as well, and where there are fields and what's there now. But and also, simply I need to know how long it's going to take somebody to get to somewhere, and where the river is, because obviously it got narrowed during sort of the Victorian times with the sewers, and also how London Bridge would have looked and the boats going through it, and the Portsmouth Harbour as well, what that would have looked like at that time. And I went and walked around, and the harbour's really big actually. But I thought it would be more or less like the same size, and thinking about how the Solent flowed out and the currents. So I need to look at maps, because I'm not really great with visuals and spatial awareness, so I need to literally walk my fingers along it to have a get. But I still find that really exciting, seeing layers of maps and that sort of it's almost like psychogeography, isn't it? The sort of layers of social history and what happened in those different places.
Well, I hope you wore the right kind of shoes, right? Like the Tudor shoes. Did you put those on?
No. I wore the M's. I thought that was a bit safer.
Yeah, I think so. I know before you quit your job, you were working for more than 20 years at, where have my notes gone here, for charity supporting equality and social justice. So how did that inform your writing? Did it
everything about everything. Some of it is, there's some surprise things in there. For instance, like one of the jobs I did, I worked for Brooke, which support young people in sexual health. So I worked as a centre manager. So I spent a lot of time handing out condoms, but it taught me a lot about sort of contraception. And sort of, when I sort of wrote the scene in Indigo at the end, when I wrote this original love scene, and I remember my reading group saying that Bailey isn't wearing a condom, and I said, oh. But then I just thought, well, actually, how can I expect a young woman to ask for that if I can't write it? So I'm sort of very aware of sort of young people, and sort of that's and also Rose Interrupted is very much about the sort of sexual pressure on young people, both sort of male and female. I've worked with families that have gone through child protection, so that idea about, and also families, organisations that's worked with the families of prisoners. I've been in prisons, done work in prisons. So I write a lot about prisons as well, and about that kind of gap between the rhetoric of politicians about prisons being like this holiday camp and all of, when actually prisons are anything but that, right. Indeed. So, that again, I feel was quite important, because my own biological father was in prison for a month as well for forging a cheque, which meant that when he came out, he couldn't be a nurse anymore, and he lost his house and he had a breakdown and sort of ended up homeless and died when he was younger than I am, in the 40s. I feel quite strongly about those misrepresented stories, and also about marginalized people whose stories, it's not that they don't tell their stories, it's just not listened to. And I think, again, as a role, for me, I feel that's we can change little bits of the world or little bits of opinion with narratives and stories sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can just change a little bit of that, hopefully through some of the stories that I can write. I mean, one of the ones that I've recently, Rat, which is for OUP and Barrington Stoke, about a boy called Al whose mum's been in prison, and it's a bit about food poverty. There's one teacher I think has bought 200 copies of that for his school, and it can provoke conversations about angry children and why they're angry, and about what happens when you slip through the net as well. So I think coming from a relatively cozy commuter town in Sussex, but always knowing, because of my own background, that there are other stories. Then you come to London where there are just so many stories, and you work in this sort of charity sector where you hear those stories. It's hard not to feel passionate about making those stories known.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we'll probably stop in a few minutes. So just to have one more, just to encourage people to send in questions again. Oh, we have a comment from Sarah. I have to go, but thank you so much, Patrice and Carole.
Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. You must speak to young people a lot now that you're a writer, and I get the impression that you do events in schools and whatnot. Yeah. What do you learn from those events?
That year 10s never ask questions, but I mean, it was interesting. I think in 2019, weirdly enough, I sort of did a lot. I did events, I think, for Hong Kong Readers Festival, so in schools in Hong Kong. I've done, schools over, in young people in Wales, Scotland, England, lots of places, Italy as well, because there's been Italian translations of Orange Boy now, sort of Rose Interrupted. And I mean, I suppose I'm just so in awe of young people anyway, I think, and always have been. I just think, the world that they're growing up in isn't the world as it should be, even pre-pandemic. I just think, and if we look at all the things that are happening now around climate change and just, what's happening in terms of, poverty and food poverty, it should not be happening. And I just think we as a generation have let them down a little bit, but they have so much, the young people that I meet are just so open-minded and sort of tolerant and questioning and sort of passionate about things. And when I feel a bit down, I just think I shouldn't be, because actually we've got this amazing generation of young people who are having conversations that I could not dream of having when I was 15 or 16 around different people's identities and what that means. And it's just I'm just so proud of them, really. And I mean, I also learned about the importance of books to them and of representation, because I would have young people. And I talk very openly when I do school events about being fostered and about my dad being in prison. And so you'd have a young person who goes, "Geez, I was fostered," or, "Yeah, my dad's in prison." And we'd have that conversation. And it's not only the representation in books, but someone like me can say, actually, these experiences have happened to me, and this is the adult I am, and this is what I do with all of these things. I put them in stories. So, yeah, I meet sort of young people, and I particularly enjoy meeting young people who are the young people who may think that their experiences aren't represented in books. I think that it's a way of saying that you are important too. And particularly because the curriculum is still the curriculum. The English curriculum is a curriculum that I did, and I didn't even do GCSEs, I did O-levels. It is still the same. It's shameful. We're not preparing young people for a global society. We're still preparing them to believe that England is a be-all and end-all, particularly dead white guys. And, and literature and writing is so many other things. So when you get young people who are into spoken word, or young people creating their own graphic art or graphic magazines, and even young people doing cosplay and using their creativity for that, I just think they're amazing, really amazing.
Yeah. Do you think, how do you think white writers should deal with this question of representation and, in their fiction? Because it can sometimes be a tricky thing for white writers. They feel like, they can be criticized sometimes. I'm just wondering, what do you think their role is?
Is it awful to say that I don't care? I just think the reason is because I think it's nobody at all is entitled to be published ever. And I think sometimes there's a degree of entitlement in some writers who are like, I'm not allowed to write this character. And I just think, you know, people of colour have been writing about people of colour for so long that they, you know, and haven't been published. And I think it's such a complicated thing. I think because publishing, again, is predominantly white, it sometimes feels it's easier to see characters of colour filtered through white writers' eyes than it is through writers of colour. And because maybe there are many, you know, publishers who don't necessarily get those little points of reference that writers of colour might put in for other people of colour who might be reading their books. So, you know, there's a real issue. And I think, you know, a lot of the white writers who talk about being cancelled, you think about Lionel Shriver or Pullman or the others, you know, they're not. You know, Lionel Shriver pops up at every literary festival. She still gets to write big columns. You know, Philip Pullman has like his name in, you know, underneath shelves in bookshops. And I just think, you know, white writers can write what they want, but if they're writing something that, again, going back to children, that causes harm, then I think, you know, they need to listen about why that happens, because we as writers should not cause harm to children. We really shouldn't. Yeah, I see it all the time. Some of my publishers think I shouldn't. Just get over yourself. Really? And it was interesting. I was doing a co-tutoring with the writer Melvin Burgess, who basically kind of kick-started the sort of YA that I write when he wrote Junk. And we were co-tutoring him in Scotland last week. And he talked about his friend Peter Callow, who's a black writer. And three of them have created a sort of their own universe and have each written stories setting that. Melvin's character is mixed race, and he said he didn't intend to write a mixed race character, but first Peter Callow said, oh, please don't write any white saviours. And then sort of Peter Callow went through with him, even things like, she's a black girl, she probably won't flick her hair because her hair's not flicky, you know, and little details. And then sort of Melvin said, you know, that he said to Pete, you know, well, we get worried, you know, that if we do the things wrong, that we'll be called racist. And Pete said, so what do you think black people have been called? You know, the names that we have been called on the street, in the media. Again, you know, I honestly, they're going to do what they're going to do. Publishers are going to publish. And some white writers do amazing stuff. You know, I love, is it Bridget Blankley's The Spirits and Jamal? I think is an amazing book, fantastic book. I love William Sutcliffe's Concentrate, which I think is absolutely amazing. But also if you think again, like As DeSalle's Boy Everywhere, which is about a Syrian refugee boy, as isn't a Syrian refugee. But she really, all the people who write books about others that aren't like them, that really resonate, are people who really care, who really do it, not because it's an academic exercise or just, you know, because they think they should, it's actually really care. And that shows in the writing. And I think if a white writer isn't prepared to discuss issues like racism or others, you know, being othered or those difficulties, then I just think, why are you writing that character? Is it just simply because that's what publishing thinks, you know, diversity is? So it's, you know, white writers have dominated writing, so I need to find a headspace to care, actually.
Yeah,
sounds harsh, but you know, it's, you know.
No, I didn't mean my question to be.
No, it's not. But I mean, it's the first time. I think when Orange Boy came out, I think it was Anthony Horowitz. There was an interview with him in the BBC saying, "Oh, my editor has, as you know, said I'm not allowed to write black characters," and he was a bit cheesed off about it. And I was just thinking, you know, you've kind of got this writing empire. You've done so much. It's honestly, you haven't got an entitlement to write a black character if you're not going to do it well. Why would you want to do that? You've already got all of this. You know, we have to have some of our stories as well.
Yeah. Let's see. Another thank you, and from Rebecca Smith as well. And can you just end with any advice you would give to writers at the beginning? I also want to have a call out to Bridget Blankley. She's one of our PhD students at Southampton. So it's nice. It's so lovely to hear. Her book is beautiful. So
it is. It's fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But any advice you'd give to people at the beginning of their writer career, or any stage, I suppose, but especially people just now beginning to think seriously about being a writer?
I mean, I think, one, I just think write for the joy of it and see where it takes you. I think we sometimes, again, I think that's been quite liberating for me, because I didn't have like YA in mind or whatever. I think I just wrote. And I think people, you know, do try to write for the market, but actually we don't actually know what the market is. I've just read a fantastic proof of a YA book. I think it's called The Cats We Meet on the Way, by, and I can't remember her name. Is it Nadia Mikhail? It's published by Guppy Books, and it comes out next year. So Guppy had a competition for, I think it's YA writing, and this one, and it's set in Malaysia, and it's, I mean, the sort of context is that an asteroid is going to land on the Earth in I don't know, 4 months or something. And scientists knew about it for 4 years and did nothing. But that's not what really it's about. It's just about a girl and her mum and a girl's boyfriend and her family who drive a camper van. And there was an ugly cat as well who actually creeps onto the van to go and find this girl's estranged sister. So it's kind of about little kindnesses, and it's about family, and it's about rethinking the past and really what would you do if the end of the world was nigh? But it's not an apocalyptic thing, because it's actually much more micro than that. And that's like nothing on the market, you know, absolutely isn't. It's a really sort of gorgeous, you know, thoughtful book that I just like read in one sitting when I was actually not intended to read anything. I should have been doing something else. So I just think, you know, when you're writing, just be brave, write about the things that you really care about, because, you know, if your book does get published, you're going to be sitting with that book for so long, writing so many drafts of it, talking about it for an eternity. But write about, you know, and the things that you write can be personal, because nobody's reading your notebooks on your iPad at the moment. So, you know, let it all go out on there. And then afterwards, use that and put that in and shape it and trim it and make it into something that is uniquely you. So don't, you know, what makes a book special is when it comes from you. You know, because we could read lots of generic type of books, but that one, like this one, the cats that we meet on the way, it's like, oh my days, you know, I've not read anything like that. And it is, and that Bridget's book as well, I've not read anything like that. So be brave and make that book, you know, part of you.
Excellent advice. Thank you so much. Patrice, it's just been wonderful to talk to you again.
And to you.
Conversation. Yeah, thank you so much.
Hopefully we'll meet in person next year or sometime.
Yes, that would be wonderful. Absolutely. Thank you all for listening and being here and asking such great questions tonight as well. So there's some closing slides that the festival likes to have me talk about. So it's really helpful to us if you could spend a couple of minutes letting us know how tonight's event was. That helps us shape future digital events as well. And there's a URL there, very complicated, starting with bit.ly, that you can be able to click on for us. This event, as I mentioned, is part of the Southampton Arts and Humanities Festival. It goes on until the 20th of November and the end of this week. So please take a look, see what else is going on. And on Saturday, there's still a few events left for Hands-On Humanities Day. And you can follow us on the social media. There's the hashtag UOS Arts Hum Fest. I hope all of you are able to do. I want to have a few thank yous for Sylvia from Public Engagement Group, and for Aisha Jahan, a colleague of mine who also helps in the background, and Rebecca Smith, my wonderful colleague who is in the audience today. And finally, again, to Patrice, thank you so much. Bye.